You inherited genes from people you've never met. And maybe, just maybe, from a species that isn't even human. One tiny mutation lets some people live and breathe comfortably in places that would leave you gasping for air. Another one turns milk into a superfood, while a different one turns a single drink of alcohol into something that feels a lot like poison. And somewhere in this story, there's an ancient survival gene that once saved your ancestors' lives that might, right now, be quietly working against you in a modern pandemic. None of that is science fiction. It's sitting inside you right now. Let's start with the one hiding in your kitchen. The milk mutation. The average person thinks drinking a glass of milk is just normal. Evolution disagrees. Here's the part that surprises people first. Being able to digest milk as an adult isn't the human default. It's actually the exception, the upgrade, the glitch that turned out to be useful. For most of human history, and for a huge chunk of the world's population today, the ability to digest milk quietly shuts off after childhood. That's not broken. That's the original factory setting. So what changed? About 8,000 years ago, certain groups in Europe, parts of Africa, and the Middle East started keeping cows, goats, and sheep, not just for meat, but for milk. And here's the part that made all the difference. In a brutal famine year, a person whose body could still handle milk into adulthood suddenly had access to an entire food source everyone else couldn't touch. That's not a minor perk. That's the line between a family that survives the winter and one that doesn't. So the trait spread, fast, in evolutionary terms, and today, without ever thinking about it, a huge share of people with European ancestry are walking around with this. Scientists call the gene behind it LCT. You can just think of it as the milk survival upgrade. But the story flips completely the moment you leave dairy farming regions. In East Asia, large parts of Africa, and indigenous communities across the Americas, that update never had a reason to install because dairy farming was never central to survival there. So today, well over half the people on Earth are lactose intolerant as adults, and it's not a malfunction. Their ancestors simply never needed the patch. Next time someone tells you milk does a body good, just remember, for most of human history, that sentence would have sent half the species running for a bathroom. That's genetics deciding what you can eat. But it also decided something you can see the moment you look in the mirror. Skin. Here's a trait everyone notices immediately, and almost nobody thinks about the actual mechanism running underneath it. As early humans spread out of Africa toward regions with less direct sunlight, skin tone gradually shifted, generation after generation, over thousands of years. That's not random drift. It's a trade-off between two things your body desperately needs and can't have both of at once. Darker skin blocks UV damage in high sun environments. Lighter skin lets more UV in, which your body needs to manufacture vitamin D in places where sunlight is scarce for half the year. Neither version is the upgrade. They're two completely different answers to two completely different environments. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The moment a person's ancestry doesn't match the sunlight where they actually live, that trade-off turns into a real cost. Vitamin D deficiency runs higher in some populations at high latitudes. Skin cancer risk runs higher in others living far from where their ancestors evolved. Your skin is still running code written for a location your family may have left thousands of years ago. Speaking of things your body still hasn't updated, here's one that turns a party into a medical event. Alcohol. Why do millions of people turn bright red after a single drink? Most people assume it's just a low tolerance. It's actually something much stranger. It's a specific genetic variant, extremely common in people of East Asian ancestry, where a gene responsible for breaking down alcohol basically stalls out halfway through the job. The alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct that just sits there in your bloodstream instead of clearing out. And the flushing, the headache, the nausea, that's not weakness. That's your body waving a red flag directly at you. Then scientists found something nobody expected. Some researchers believe this reaction may have originally been protective, not a curse. Early rice farming regions of China created perfect conditions for toxic mold to grow in stored grain, and the same gene variant that makes alcohol miserable may have also helped the body deal with certain mold toxins. In other words, evolution may not have forgotten to fix this one. It might have built it on purpose, for a threat almost nobody alive today has ever had to think about. Your genes still think you're guarding against moldy rice from 1,000 years ago. They haven't quite caught up to the fact that Uber Eats exists. If alcohol reveals what your ancestors were eating, the next one reveals it even more literally. Starch. Here's a hidden one almost nobody's heard of, and scientists almost missed it completely. Because for a long time, nobody thought to count how many copies of this gene people actually had. Some populations with a long history of grain-heavy diets, think wheat, rice, agricultural societies stretching back thousands of years, carry way more copies of a gene called AMY1, which controls an enzyme in your saliva that starts breaking down starch the second food hits your tongue. Populations with a longer history of hunting and less reliance on farmed grain tend to carry fewer copies. More copies mean starch gets processed faster and smoother. It sounds small until you realize it might explain part of why some people handle carbs more easily than others. And the answer traces directly back to what crop their ancestors were farming, or not farming, millennia ago. But food differences are nothing compared to what evolution had to do to keep entire populations alive against a killer. Malaria. Here's a genetic trait carried by a huge number of people with West and Central African ancestry that, in one copy, protects against one of the deadliest diseases in human history. In two copies, it causes a serious blood condition. Same gene, two totally different outcomes, depending entirely on how many copies you happen to get. It's called sickle cell trait, and it exists because of malaria. In regions where malaria has been a constant threat for thousands of years, a single copy of this gene subtly reshapes red blood cells, just enough that the malaria parasite can't survive well inside them. One copy, and you get real protection against a disease that has killed more humans throughout history than almost anything else. Two copies, and you develop sickle cell disease, which is genuinely serious. Evolution wasn't chasing a perfect outcome here. It was chasing survival at the population level, even when that meant some individuals paid a steep price for it. The story gets even weirder from here. Different continents solved the exact same malaria problem completely independently. The Mediterranean developed a totally different protective mutation called thalassemia. Parts of Southeast Asia developed yet another one. Different populations, different mutations, same enemy, solved over and over, in parallel, by evolution running the identical experiment in places that had zero contact with each other. Keeping people alive against disease was one problem. Keeping them warm turned out to be an even harder one. Arctic cold. Populations that have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, including Inuit communities across Greenland and northern Canada, carry gene variants that completely rewired how their bodies process fat, letting them thrive on a diet almost impossibly high in fat and protein, seals, whales, blubber, a diet that would tank most people's health. Their bodies adapted to burn that fat differently and generate more internal heat from it, in a place where a single bad hunting season could mean starvation without that edge. But something even stranger happened once the modern world showed up. When Arctic communities shift toward a modern, processed, carbohydrate-heavy diet, that ancient fat-burning advantage doesn't just stop helping. In some cases, it works against them, contributing to higher rates of certain metabolic conditions. The gene never changed. The world around it did. A trait built to save your life in one environment can quietly turn into a liability the moment that environment disappears. If cold could rewrite your metabolism, wait until you hear what the ocean did to one population's actual organs. The Bajau sea divers. Imagine holding your breath underwater, no tank, no gear, for minutes at a time, diving over 200 feet down on a single lungful of air. Then imagine discovering your body has been quietly stockpiling extra oxygen this whole time, without you ever asking it to. That's the Bajau, a population living on the water off Southeast Asia for generations, sometimes called sea nomads. And scientists almost missed this discovery entirely. It only happened when a research team decided, almost on a hunch, to run ultrasounds on freedivers who'd never been studied that way before. What they found? The Bajau spleens are measurably larger than neighboring populations, and the spleen works like an internal oxygen tank, releasing a fresh burst of oxygenated blood cells into the bloodstream mid-dive. Evolution basically installed the premium survival package into an entire community, and it took modern researchers strapping monitors on freedivers to even notice. If the ocean floor demanded a bigger spleen, the mountains demanded something even stranger. Tibetan altitude. Go to the Tibetan plateau, roughly 14,000 feet up, air so thin a fit, healthy visitor can get altitude sickness just climbing a hill. Imagine hiking up that mountain while everyone around you is gasping, doubled over, dizzy, reaching for oxygen tanks, and you're just walking, breathing easy, like you're back home at sea level. That's not a fantasy. That's daily life for people whose families have lived there for generations. Their bodies found a completely different way around the oxygen problem entirely, one that doesn't even involve thickening the blood the way a lowlander's body tries to when it's starved for air. And then, evolution did something nobody saw coming. The specific gene responsible, scientists call it EPAS1, you can just think of it as the high-altitude survival gene, wasn't even invented by human evolution. It came from Denisovans, an extinct relative of modern humans, through interbreeding tens of thousands of years ago. Tibetan populations today are carrying a working piece of DNA from a species that no longer exists, and it's actively keeping them alive at altitudes that would put almost anyone else in a hospital bed. It's one of the clearest known cases of an extinct human relative directly improving the survival of people alive right now. And 3 separate populations solved this same problem 3 completely different ways. The Andes went with more oxygen-carrying red blood cells. The Ethiopian highlands found yet another solution scientists are still mapping out. Nobody copied anybody. Evolution just kept finding a way, over and over, in isolation. Which brings us to the biggest one. The one that ties this entire story together. Neanderthal DNA. Everything we've talked about so far came from modern humans, adapting, generation after generation, to the world around them. This next one didn't. This one came from a species that went extinct roughly 40,000 years ago. And you may still be carrying part of it, right now, without ever knowing it. If your ancestry traces outside of Africa, there's a real chance you're carrying actual Neanderthal DNA in your body this very moment. Not metaphorically, literally. Inherited from interbreeding that happened tens of thousands of years ago. Most people with non-African ancestry carry somewhere around 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, scattered quietly through their genome, doing its job without ever asking permission. Some of that inherited DNA shaped the immune system in ways that likely helped early humans survive unfamiliar diseases the moment they left Africa. For a while, scientists couldn't explain why certain people got so much sicker than others during the COVID-19 pandemic, even after accounting for age and health conditions. Then, they found something nobody expected. One specific stretch of Neanderthal inherited DNA, sitting on chromosome 3, was linked to a significantly higher risk of severe illness in people infected with the virus. The exact same ancient inheritance that may have helped a distant ancestor survive a plague 40,000 years ago was, for some people alive today, working against them in a pandemic their ancestors could never have imagined. That's not evolution failing. That's just what happens when a tool built for one battlefield gets carried, unchanged, into a completely different war. Your DNA isn't trying to predict the future, it's still trying to survive the past. What it all means. This doesn't mean everyone from a given ancestry carries these exact traits. It just means the odds are different, shaped by whatever problem their ancestors were up against: malaria, altitude, cold, farming, sunlight, and whatever solution the body found, sometimes borrowed from a species that isn't even around anymore. What counted as an advantage in one environment can flip into a disadvantage the second that environment changes, through migration, modern diets, or a virus none of these genes were ever built to face. The story of your DNA isn't just the story of your family, it's the story of humanity, spreading into deserts, mountains, ice, and open ocean, and figuring out a way to survive every single one of them. And in some cases, like that piece of Denisovan altitude DNA, like the Neanderthal genes still sitting quietly on your chromosomes, it's also the story of species that disappeared long before history was ever written down, still finishing their sentence through you. Every scar, every mutation, every strange little quirk in your DNA is a receipt from a battle your ancestors survived. Your body isn't just carrying genes, it's carrying victories, losses, famines, diseases, ice ages. Every heartbeat, every breath, every cell in your body is proof that, for thousands of generations, your ancestors kept surviving, just long enough for you to exist.